Well, it is National Police Week, and in the House of Representatives, we're seeing many Republicans use this as an opportunity to perpetuate a couple of ideas. The first is just, they've shown us, many of them, is a false idea or purported principle that they back the blue or are for law enforcement or believe in the rule of law and order. And then a second idea, it's being used as an opportunity to perpetuate false ideas about crime surging when, of course, crime is plummeting under President Joe Biden. The first thing I want to show you is Eric Swalwell, a Democratic congressman, calling out Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, again, she would purport to be super against defunding the police and for funding law enforcement, but she sold merchandise that's defund the FBI merchandise, trying to defund federal law enforcement. Why? Well, to punish them for daring to enforce the law when it comes to Donald Trump. Here's Eric Swalwell.
So to me, when I hear some of my colleagues, again, not all of them, but some of them on this committee thump their chest and say that they back the blue, but then they're going to call a January 6th convict a hostage, that's not back in the blue, that's back in the coup. And when some of them say that they back the blue, but the second the blue raids the house of their preferred candidate for president, that's not backing the blue, that's backing a fool. And so I'm all about supporting law enforcement and honoring them during Police Week, but we got to be consistent.
Yeah, and again, I'll describe for our podcast listeners, behind him, he has, I guess, a social media post of Marjorie Taylor Greene promoting her defund the FBI merchandise. So there he brought up the January 6th prisoners, and Trump and MAGA now refers to them as hostages and is making heroes out of them, martyrs. And they are acting like there's something patriotic about what they did in attacking the Capitol, violently going after police officers, trying to block the peaceful transfer of power. And those are this movement's heroes, where Trump at the beginning of rallies salutes as the national anthem is sung by these individuals. Just very strange. And again, referring to them as hostages, people who attacked the police, again, while they tried to get into the Capitol to prevent a lawful certification of an election. You don't back law enforcement if those are the people that you're applauding. And on top of that, right now, to the point of the defund the FBI merchandise, you have this MAGA idea. It's one of the demands that Marjorie Taylor Greene had for Mike Johnson that prompted her to try to oust him. You have MAGA wanting to defund the Department of Justice at large, and obviously her specifically targeting the FBI. This is the type of precedent you set that could just unravel the rule of law, because you're saying that the people who do have the power of the purse, who do have a lot of power to wield in a Congress, will go after organizations tasked with enforcing the law. They'll go after them if they dare to enforce the law when it comes to the leader of a given party. That's not the behavior of people who respect the rule of law, but it is the behavior of this MAGA Republican Party. Now, interestingly, also, you have Mike Johnson being confronted here by a reporter with a simple question, but Mike Johnson doesn't have a very good answer for it, which is that the Republican Study Committee actually seems to want to defund law enforcement. And Mike Johnson says he's not familiar with the details. The Republican Study Committee is a group of more than 170 House Republicans.
We've heard a lot this week about Democrats supporting defund the police. The Republican Study Committee budget cuts the main federal grant program that local departments use to hire officers. How is that not proposing to defund the police?
I haven't looked into the details of the RSC budget. There's lots of nuances. They also plus up other areas where you support law enforcement, because that's a central theme of what we believe. It's part of our worldview, it's part of our party platform, and it will always be consistent.
Yeah, so not much of an answer, saying he's not familiar with the details, but I'm sure somewhere else we're making up for that. I can't cite where, but we're fine. We love the police. Okay. And it's reminding me of, in an effort to avoid having to answer for the fact that they refused to implement laws on gun regulations that would be common sense, that would help to save lives and prevent so much gun violence like we experience uniquely bad in this country. And to distract from the fact that they won't do anything on gun regulations, they'll say, well, that's because I care about mental health investment. But then you look at the record, as we've gone through in detail before, and it's always Democrats proposing the investment into mental health programs. It's always Republicans shooting it down and trying to obstruct those very investments. So when it comes time to make the mental health investments they're talking about, oh, we don't have the money. We don't have the money because we got to do another tax cut for the wealthy. Goodness gracious. And then you have a good zinger here from Jim McGovern, a Democratic congressman.
No reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, the gentleman keeps on talking about crime in D.C., crime on the rise. I can tell you one thing, crime is definitely down in the White House right now. And
brutal. That's what you call brutal. And then before we get to more from Jim McGovern, I'll just remind you, they're pushing, it doesn't make any sense. What's the point of people working so hard to report on, gather factual information, do studies, analyze statistical data, understand crime in the country, and then after all of that's done, provided to us evidence that crime is plummeting, you can just be a dang Fox News pundit or Republican politician and go, I don't care, it's surging, and just make it up, pull it out of your you-know-where. And then Biden, after he's overseen the largest federal investment in public safety, violence reduction, law enforcement in his presidency, and it just so happens we've seen a rapid decline in crime, where violent crime, after the huge surge that started under Donald Trump in violent crime, in part because of the pandemic, we're already back down with violent crime to near more than 50-year lows. And we've seen some historic drops in homicide rates. And none of that is something that Biden's given credit for. Now, is it all because of him? No. We had a huge spike. Pandemic conditions helped to create that. And so some of that was going to come down naturally as we got the pandemic under control. But it's wild. It is wild that we can live in this fact-free world where now Republicans can go around acting like Biden has been for defunding the police, and that's why crime's spiking, when he's making huge investments in law enforcement and crime is plummeting. And yes, you can both want to fund properly law enforcement and also understand that reforms should be made to make policing more accountable and more effective, and make sure we have more qualified officers and all those different things. Here's more from McGovern.
this House of Representatives, their candidate for president has been indicted more times than he's been elected.
The chair would remind us to refrain from engaging in personalities towards presumptive nominees for the office of president.
I didn't think I was. And somehow, Madam Speaker, they have the nerve to tell us about the criminal justice system. Give me a break. Their credibility on this issue has evaporated. It is pathetic.
Indubitably,
probably not the best idea.
Is what I would say to that. And we'll get to a really good example of the dishonesty of networks like Fox News in a second here. One more moment from Jim McGovern. But it is hard to say you're the party of law and order when very likely, very soon, the nominee of your party is going to be a convicted felon. We'll see how this case turns out, but it's a little tough to make that case. And also, let's even get away from that, because they would say, oh yeah, but the cases are unfair. All right, let's just completely set that to the side. I've debunked that idea before, but let's just set it aside. Also, on the merits of the record, as I mentioned with Mike Johnson, that's a really important part of this too. It's funny to point out that Trump is very likely soon to be a convicted criminal, and he's the leader of the party that says they're for law and order. And in response to the fact that he's being prosecuted, they're trying to undermine the justice system and defund organizations that dare to hold Trump accountable. So all of that is interesting and important to point out. And also their portrayal of the Democratic Party as this anti-rule of law party is ridiculous, given the record, especially the contrast between the two parties' record. And then here's a little bit more from Jim McGovern.
And I can understand why the gentleman is confused. Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from the Washington Post entitled, "Crime is Down, Though Fox News Viewers Might Not Be Aware."
Without objection.
The article notes, and I quote, "The reality is that crime surged in 2020 when Trump was president. That surge continued into the Biden administration, but has since waned," end quote. And Madam Speaker, in the lead up to the 2022 midterms, Fox News invested immense resources in promoting stories about surging crime despite lacking evidence. And while crime is down, it appears the conservative ecosystem is trying to fearmonger the issue of crime once again because, that's all they have. Madam Speaker, I also request unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from The Guardian entitled, "Crime Coverage on Fox News Halved Once U.S. Midterms Were Over."
Without objection.
So after a frenzy of coverage about violent crime in September and October of 2022, the conservative media giant Fox News actually decreased coverage of violent crime stories by, get this, 50% in the weeks following the 2022 elections. Crime stories have long been used by Republicans to fearmonger for cheap electoral victories, and it seems like this old tactic is being...
Okay, and let me just say again, it's one thing to fearmonger about a modest increase in crime rates and try to make it seem like it's out of control to hurt the other side. It's a whole nother thing to know. They have to know, unless they just can't read basic information. They have to know that crime is actually plummeting under Biden, and to still fearmonger as if it's out of control when we rarely see sharp decreases like what we're currently seeing under President Joe Biden. And if crime's currently out of control, then at least violent crime was even more out of control under Donald Trump, statistically. And it's just ridiculous, but that's the moment we're in. And it's super important that we call it out, because there, the point he's making about Fox News is that similar to what they do with migrant caravans, as Trump would say, oh, you're hearing about it so much in the weeks leading up to an election. The second that election is over, the story of the migrant caravan and where it was headed to and where it's going is over. And that's what we saw with crime too. A 50% decrease in violent crime stories after the midterms. They're overtly a political arm of the Republican Party and of the Trump campaign. And it's stunning to watch how brazenly they do that. Crime, and then the election's over, boom, never mind. Nah, we're not actually worried about that. We don't actually care about the people that we were pretending like we cared about with the victims of crime. Instead, it was just a political tool. And in this case, a super dishonestly utilized political tool. I'll leave it there. Let me know what you thought of all that in the comments.